while, and there follows the bit where we all talk together. So precepts, we will, I guess this is the third or fourth in a set of talks I've given as we walk through this set of precepts. We finished up last time at the end of the 3 pure precepts, so we will pick up and talk about the 5 training precepts today. The 3 pure precepts, we really talked about those. Those are a fairly high level. They're principles. They're basically to live in truth, to live for the benefit of others, to see things as they are. So the 5 training precepts, in an important way, are bringing those down to where we actually live, to where we show up in the world, in these spacesuits, in these sacks of skin and bones. The way we navigate this world and how we interact with others and how we live in this body. So they're very practical. They're described as the training precepts. In the Pali Canon, they are, and in the Theravadan tradition as it comes down to us, they are talked about as training precepts. In most monastic traditions, they're talked about as training precepts. And the reason they are training precepts is as long as we're in this organism, as long as this is what's operating in the world, all we can do is try, because it makes mistakes. We're constantly training. So they're a place for us to bring our attention, bring our effort, and just continue to try. One of the things I really like about about Buddhist teaching in general, but particularly the way it showed, this piece of it shows up in the Theravadan tradition, is the idea of we're practicing to be skillful. Skillful, well, I guess it's universal. Skillful means upaya kozala, often upaya, which I think is just means. So upaya kozala is skillful means. So the idea of skillful means, what we're doing is when we're training, we're doing things and we're trying to figure out what works. We're constantly trying to figure out whether this is skillful, whether it's not. Sorry, whether it works or whether it's not. If it works, it's skillful. Let's practice that. Let's do a little more of that. If it's not, let's not. That was unskillful. And the basic metric for skillful is, does it reduce suffering? Is what I'm doing helping to reduce suffering, or is it not? If it is, let's do a little bit more of that. And that's my own suffering and the suffering of others. So through that lens, aware of the suffering caused by the destruction of life, we start with awareness. We have to start. We also finish with awareness, right? I mean, we've got to stay aware all the time. But we start with awareness. We've got to be mindful. We've got to be paying attention. So we notice that the destruction of life causes suffering. If I'm involved in the destruction of life, it causes my own suffering. But it certainly causes suffering for whatever life is destroyed, and it causes suffering for the beings that surround that life, that interact with that life. So the destruction of life causes suffering. Aware of that, we make the vow. We undertake this training precept. This is how I choose to live my life, because I see this act causes suffering and that's undesirable. I choose to live my life in a direction and to train myself not to kill. Now Thich Nhat Hanh picks up this, and he has much longer paragraphs in the Plum Village tradition, and they're much stronger in the second part, which is to prevent others from killing. I find that, for me, that's a little bit strong. So where do you draw the line on stepping in and stopping others from killing? But certainly there's an edge there, that the awareness of the destruction of life causing suffering, it's not enough to just stop here. It's not enough to say, I'm not going to kill. Because we do influence the rest of the world. So how do we choose to spread that out? So it says here, not to condone killing. And the precepts, they're training precepts. Each of us practices with these precepts within the bounds of our experience and the bounds of our ability, and we bring them home. They're our precepts, it's our life. we have to figure out the meaning for us. So for each of us, what is the meaning of not condoning killing? For some people, it could very easily become very activist. For others, it could be much more quiet. But there is an edge there that we're all stepping into of how does killing by other beings cause suffering, and what is the role of this being in that third-party interaction? Because there is a role, and it's not enough to just sit aside and watch. I have to acknowledge that and make some move around not condoning, around acknowledging, and in a way moving towards reducing that suffering. Because what other people do is what I do. We're the same thing. Truly, we're the same thing. Aware of the suffering caused by exploitation, stealing, and oppression. Obviously, this is an expansion of not taking what is freely offered, which is the standard. Not stealing, not taking what is not freely offered. We normally think of that in material terms, but that is such a limited way of looking at what we take. Breaking a window and taking something out of the front of the store is certainly taking something that's not freely offered. But being rude to somebody in a store, cutting somebody off in a car because you're in a rush, you're taking something from somebody. Each of those is an instance of taking somebody's peace, taking somebody's dignity, taking some piece of someone's humanity and self-respect. We are taking something that wasn't freely offered. So every aspect of exploitation, stealing, and oppression is an act of taking. And as such, it is causing suffering. And if it causes suffering, dukkha, unsatisfactoriness, unreliability, stress, if it causes that anywhere, it certainly causes it here, in this body. And part of our practice as we move into this place of awareness, we become more aware of sensation within this body, and we become more able to notice how, the extent to which and quite how, all of these external things, these acts of destruction of life, exploitation, stealing, oppression, and so forth, how they cause stress in this body. We can feel it tightening. We can feel the natural openness of our life just closing in a little bit. Can close up a lot, but we can even feel just a little bit of closing in. And so we move into that and undertake as this training precept to open back up again, to become peace, to spread peace by not participating and by not condoning. These, you can draw direct lines between these and the pure precepts, by the way. I mean, the non-harming and non-violence, ahimsa and satyagraha, are both really here in these first couple, and they're pure precept. And the third one is aware of the suffering caused by inappropriate interpersonal relationships, especially sexual misconduct. That one actually ties back to brahmacharya, which is the one that is living well, living truly, living in truth. But as that comes down to us over time, that language has limited itself traditionally to the sexual relationships. But there's so much more in relationships that can be problematic for all. So sexual relationships aren't the only kind of relationship that can become inappropriate. We have to be very careful about all of our interpersonal relationships. It is very easy, particularly when we get into intimate relationships, family relationships with spouses, with children, with parents. They can very easily build in these edges of abuses, hierarchical control mechanisms, which can then become strongly habitual, deeply ingrained, and cause enormous dukkha. So what this is calling us to do is, again, become aware of the suffering that those inappropriate relationships cause. So when we're in interpersonal relationships, be aware of suffering that happens in there, which starts to allow us to see where there are inappropriate elements in those relationships and what we can do within this training precept to reduce those inappropriate elements of those relationships, and to make sure that we're not entering into relationships that on their face are just inappropriate. And beyond that, not to condone that in others. And again, for each of us to figure out what that means. I mean, if I've got a kid who's entering an inappropriate interpersonal relationship with somebody else, sometimes directly interfering in that could cause more harm than good. Sometimes it could be the right thing to do, and it's exactly what's needed to separate that child from causing themselves harm. So we've each got to figure out what that means in the circumstances. But the precept is to become aware of it and to act in a way that will reduce suffering, reduce dukkha, reduce stress. Aware of the suffering caused by unmindful speech and not listening deeply. Listening deeply is a borrowing very much from Thich Nhat Hanh. One of the traditions, I loved one of the things he talked about, which is after the Vietnam War, he had a role in reconciliation work, and he got the two groups of people together, two sides in the war, and he said, okay, today you folks will just sit down and you will listen, and you folks can talk. You guys and gals can't say a word, you just listen. Tomorrow you get to talk, and you folks will sit and listen. And then when we've done that for a while, then we can have a conversation. We have to begin by deep listening. We have to begin by truly hearing the other. If we can't truly hear, we don't actually have anything meaningful to say, because we're not talking to what's there. We've got to truly listen. And when we think about loving somebody, true love is really letting somebody be just what they are. It's not telling them what to be. It's not trying to, well, I'm going to marry this person. I love them dearly. There's these three little things, and we've just got to, when those three things are fixed, it'll just be perfect. So it's 95% perfect, and we'll move in and we'll think, no, you just got to love somebody the way they are. That's love. It is giving somebody the space to be who they are. And for that to happen, you've got to start by listening deeply. We have to start by listening deeply. And when we've listened deeply, then we're in a place to talk skillfully, to speak skillfully into that. There's something else I've found very powerful is out of the Toltec tradition. There's a book by, I think it's Don Miguel Ruiz, and it very closely parallels the teachings of Don Carlos in Carlos Castaneda. Don Carlos, I believe. And it has 4 agreements. The 4 agreements. And the 4 agreements are be immaculate with your word, don't take things personally, don't make assumptions, and always do your best. And that's it. The first of those is be immaculate with your words. Doesn't talk about all the precepts, it's just your word. This is such a powerful way that we engage with the world. And it's a place where our mindfulness so naturally deserts us, because we're not conscious of what comes out of our mouth. Most of what comes out is spontaneous. We can be thoughtful about what we're going to say, but if you really look closely, that doesn't come down to the level of which words do we use. What comes out of our mouth, to a huge extent, is spontaneously formed within this thing. We've got to be and it's so powerful what comes out of our mouths. What comes out, the words, the tone, the timing. Be immaculate with your words. Be aware of the suffering caused by unmindful speech and not listening deeply. I undertake as a training precept not to speak falsely or unskillfully, and not to condone others doing the same. Aware of the suffering caused by unmindful consumption This precept is generally focused very much on clouding the mind with intoxicants. I've heard it talked about as not to sell alcohol, which seems kind of to kind of miss the point in a large part. There's lots of different ways of interpreting this. But with each of these, it's like, what is this really driving at? Why is it asking us to look at this behavior? And what this one is asking us to look at is to recognize that what this organism does is consume. That's how it survives this impermanence. It's constantly shedding. The way it survives is to consume and then selectively hold on. So be really careful about what this consumes. One of the practices in Ramadan, which is, of course, fasting sunrise to sunset, 30 days, one lunar cycle. It's not just food and water. The Muslim is asked to basically guard the sense gates. A deep fast in Ramadan will include fasting sex, obviously, but also the media, all forms of news and media. Being very careful about what enters through any of the sense gates. So this is expanding from just intoxicants as labeled to being mindful of all that is consumed and to be cautious of unmindful consumption. And the mind becomes clouded obviously by intoxicants, but it also becomes clouded by any inappropriate consumption. If we're not watching what we're bringing in, then we get sucked up in what we're bringing in. We get consumed by it. And it starts to redirect our thinking, redirect our behavior. It can become an addiction, right? I mean, anything we take too much, it's not classically in clinical terms an addiction maybe, but it can become something that our mind becomes hooked on. And we are redirecting our thought processes to this and away from mindfulness and away from presence. And to the extent we're directing ourselves away from mindfulness and away from presence, we're directing ourselves away from the ability to be with this intention to be constantly monitoring, to be practicing these training precepts, and to be in the world with the intention of reducing suffering, ours and others. That's enough words from me. What does this all bring up for you folks? Questions, comments, thoughts?
I just wanted to understand more on the not to condone in any of these precepts, right? In current world, in the way we are involved, and as a single individual, there are so many external factors.
Yeah.
And so just like you described, and I have worked on the activism side. I have my friends, right? If you talk to them, because as we talked about not to do something, they can take it to the activism level, and for them anything else is less.
Mm-hmm.
You have to come to that level of activism to do anything.
Mm-hmm.
But in our daily lives, not everybody can go and every day become an activist, or they don't choose to, that's up to them. But so how do we reconcile truly not to condone something, because so many external factors, and it's just overwhelming at times, and we see daily that it is continuing, it is happening, right? I don't think personally, as an individual, I can stop it, yes, but definitely I can give my bit, but that bit sometimes seems so small in that whole ocean, so I don't know how to reconcile that.
It's a great question, and this let me go and come to you, Karen, in just a minute. It's a great question, and it really is the heart of all of our practice. Why are we practicing in the first place? Why are we all sitting in here right now? And the reason, fundamentally, that we'll all put different words around it. We'll all have our own personal history of what brings us here. But fundamentally, we want to be happy. And we want everybody we know to be happy. It's about finding that peace, that happiness, peace of God which passeth all understanding, however you want to label it. But it's about finding that. It's about being that, living as that. And helping others do the same. So each of these precepts is simply a tool, a technique that heads us in that direction. So let's pick the first one, aware of the suffering caused by the destruction of life. If we can truly tune into and become aware of the suffering caused by the destruction of life, then we want to naturally take steps to reduce the suffering caused by the destruction of life. There are ways of becoming an activist that are profoundly counterproductive. There are animal rights activists who in the UK released a whole bunch of mink from fur coat factories, and the mink devastated the natural ecosystem and substantially wiped out the otter and destabilized the river systems. So that's from a really good heart. But because it wasn't thought through, because it didn't come from a place of wisdom, it had a really difficult, really challenging other side. So it's not saying don't be an activist, but there's a consideration, there's a considered approach here. And each of us has to move into wisdom and compassion together, move into the opening of the heart and the desire and the intent to relieve suffering, and the wisdom to see clearly what's really going on. So each of us has to navigate this question personally within ourselves, and for ourselves within our own personal container. Other people have their own. So what other people choose to do is what other people choose to do. That's not me. Does that make sense?
Right. But it still continues, right? So I come from a country where there is more vegetarianism, right? So it's easier when you discuss it. I have my American friends here who are born and brought up in that environment. They are eating meat. How much is that truly ingrained or in your consciousness? And how much is just that, okay, because you were given this habit, you have chosen those habits. So when some of them explains that I've tried to be vegan or tried to not to kill or not to eat, but then my body reacts in such an alarming way that I cannot continue. So after a year or 2 years or 3 years, they relapse, they go back, right? So how much of it is really, I mean, I don't know
There isn't an answer.
Yeah,
there isn't an answer. Each of us has to navigate this ourselves, and it comes out of our intent. This is why it starts with, what are you trying to do? You're trying to create peace, you're trying to create happiness. And each of us works down that path. Karen.
That's interesting, because I was actually contemplating the same thing. That's such a good example about the mink, who's trying to influence the behavior of others. Will always have consequences, and sometimes it is easy to get caught up in the impulse of this is right. What's right for me may not be right, in general. It's not an absolute term. But what I was realizing is that I personally will probably never attain that level of, as he put it, activism. But I do feel that setting an example, as opposed to telling other people what to do, is at least moving in that direction. I would much rather be concerned with, analyzing and, changing my own behavior to reduce suffering, as opposed to making it a mission to interfere with other people. But also I'm in a very, lucky, if you want to say, situation in that I talk with people all the time, and they're, openly interested in changing their own behavior. So it does give me, like a wonderful doorway to discuss those things without judgment, But I do think that judgment is harmful. So, it's a delicate balance between the two. How do I be satisfied with just being that example and sharing how something is working for me without judgment, and not cross that boundary feeling like I'm condoning something just because I can tolerate,
Right.
a wide range of behavior. But the mink was such a good example of, there are consequences for that. But that is my thought on it.
But the flip of it, thank you, and thank you. Coming back to the mink, the flip of it is, it's not okay to condone mink being harvested in this way. So what do you do, Adam? And then Amit.
Do you think in order to really like wrestle with the precepts, we first have to kind of acknowledge that they're unattainable in these physical forms? Like by virtue of even being alive, our life comes at the expense of something, another living being, like unavoidably so.
Absolutely.
And I think the precepts also speak to our most like primal urges and desires and consumption and procreation, and it's almost like it's like a paradox almost to even practice them, because they're trying to step on your shadow, you can't quite get there, because I mean our bodies right now are killing something even in our own body, and I think this is why, like in more like legalistic codes of conduct, people fall away, like because it's like don't do these things or else, and then it just doesn't work, because it's like it is you're kind of stuck with these bodies and what they need and want and all of the rest.
So I spent 2 weeks last fall at Tanisaro Bhikku's place in California, which is it's a monastery in the Thai forest tradition. And there was a conversation there at one point about the precepts. And ironically, to your point, it was astonishingly literalistic. It was like, well, if they're small, any being that is smaller than a certain size doesn't count. And plants aren't alive. I think that was a statement. Plants aren't alive for purposes of the precepts either. So yeah, I mean, it's how do you live in this body? A question though. So let me rephrase that. We end up realizing that the precepts are completely unattainable because there is nobody here to do any killing. There can be no such killing because there's nothing to kill. I mean, there's just
Can you say that?
You've got the absolute and the relative, the unmanifest and the manifest, right? The born and the unborn. There are lots of different ways of describing it. From the side of the absolute or the unborn, there is nobody. There is no Gareth. There's no doer. There's no doe. There's no doer. There is no doing. It doesn't compute, right? So we end up there. But if we travel the journey right, we end up there not as a recognition of nihilism, as a wiping out of existence. We end up there also, as Nisargadatta would say, when I know I am nothing, that is wisdom. When I know I am everything, that is compassion. And between these two shores, my life flows. So if we navigate this journey correctly, yes, we end up recognizing there's no doer, no doe, no doing, and what that brings with it is this profound compassion for everything, and the need to be with. This is the Bodhisattva vow. It's to be with everything and relieve all suffering. So that's where we end up. I don't think it's realistic to start there because we don't have the wisdom to start there. But the vows, that taking the precepts, receiving the precepts, it is one of the important steps in receiving the precepts, is to wrestle with them and say, I don't know how to do this because I've just realized that when I eat vegetables, there were insects living on these vegetables. Somehow or other I'm killing those. And in order to grow enough vegetables for me to live healthily with this vast population, we've got to destroy vast areas of forest and all the animals that used to live there. So it's an important, receiving the precepts is a step towards this. And then we continue to wrestle with, how do we live this conundrum? How do we live this contradiction? Amit?
How I see it is that a lot of people get obsessed, with either not killing or not condoning killing or both. And that obsession causes suffering, like agitation.
Absolutely.
So if our goal is to avoid or to reduce suffering, And in the process of following these precepts, if we are agitating our mind or obsessing, which again is causing suffering, then there's no point. I have seen in my family people going to great lengths to not kill, and they follow these processes or procedures where they don't even let anybody bring any eggs, like inside the house. In which, then if you are living in this life, if it is causing suffering to you or the others, we need to find a balance. That is what the Buddha said, right? So there, in everything we do in life, there are always extremes.
Yes.
And with wise intention, we need to find a way which is not causing suffering on this side, is not causing suffering to you. If it is causing a lot of agitation and suffering, it means that you are increasing your sense of self, which you don't want to do. Right? So everything has to be taken with a grain of salt, in my opinion. The goal, the overarching goal, as you said, is to reduce suffering. If by you following these precepts is causing suffering to your loved ones, then I think you're going too far.
Yeah, well, you're missing the point, because you've always got to come back to what am I doing and why.
And in our culture, we have the monks from where Buddha started in India, and even before him or after him. And so we are a land where there are a lot of sadhus, saints or monks have come, right? There are people who go on extreme, where they just never take shower because they can kill the germs, organisms on their body. So they have gone to the extreme, looking into this, that I don't want to kill anything, right? Now you're not taking a shower, and that's not even good for your own body, right? In the end. So yeah, there are extremes. I think it says somewhere you have to find that, and that's why they call middle path, I guess, somewhere in the Buddha, somewhere you have to find a balance and middle path. That's all you can do.
Karen.
As we're discussing this, and it's such a great discussion, I think part of that balance might actually be just maintaining that awareness that we're always violating we ourselves, no matter what we might judge other people to be doing, that we too, like you pointed out, are also violating, that precept to some extent or another. So continuously working on that, I think, helps us not to be so righteous. I think that's what we're talking about in terms of crossing a line, is that line is where we're being so righteous that we're inflicting harm and suffering on others. And of course, when people are harmed, they usually, out of feeling threatened or judged, will resist, and then we really haven't accomplished any good.
You made me think of one thing, which I wanted to say real quickly, and then we need to wrap up in a minute, so I want to look to Zoom before I do. But the thing you made me think of, Karen, is these precepts are for us. Each of us has our own personal relationship with the precepts, and this is to guide us in our lives. And if we start taking these precepts and using these as a metric and looking outside at how others are behaving, we've completely missed the point. We cannot do that. This is about our behavior, not about others. So it's very personal. We are at time, so I want to make sure, though, before I finish, I think I've kept my eye on Zoom, but I could have missed somebody. Is there anybody on Zoom who had something they really wanted to say who I've missed? Katie.
I was just going to say, one of the things for me in terms of practicing with the precepts is I have to practice with all of them at the same time. And that your mink example is that if you have to steal the mink to let them go, you've broken another precept. And if you get so, angry at somebody, and that you don't have to act, condoning something not condoning it condoning something you might do right away is, oh yeah, that's fine, or I don't want to say anything about that. That's just going to cause a fuss. But not condoning it is really a wide range of things that you can do over time. And so it just requires creativity or opens up for creative responses.
Thank you. So let's go to the inside back cover. Natalie, you have the music, so as you've got it there. But let's go to the inside back cover, and I mean, you do too. So the two of you, no, you use what you've got, but everybody else, it's on the inside back cover of the regular cards. And we'll do the 4 vows to finish with. Beings are numberless, I vow to awaken them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. Buddha's way is unsurpassable, I vow to embody it. Beings are numberless, I vow to awaken them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. Buddha's way is unsurpassable, I vow to embody it. Beings are numberless, I vow to awaken them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. Buddha's way is unsurpassable, I vow to embody it. Thank you all, folks. Lovely conversation.